Using documents or court cases as your line of reasoning. And remember, state your position as fact. You don't need to use I pronouns. All right, evidence. You're going to need to provide 2 pieces of evidence. Your first piece should come from the document. Well, at least one piece has to come from the prompt. It has to be a document from the prompt. I highly recommend you do it as your first piece of evidence so you don't forget. You're going to avoid those direct quotes. You can feel free to use some transitional wording to cue the reader to your reasoning, but the most important thing about that reasoning is it needs to directly connect back to the reasoning you provided in your thesis. Your second piece of evidence can come from the prompt, but it doesn't have to. If it doesn't come from the prompt, it can be another document, it can be a Supreme Court case, or a major course concept. Similarly to the fact that we don't have an introduction for this essay, we also don't have a conclusion. Instead, we are going to present an opposing viewpoint and then reiterate our thesis. You can feel free to use some transitional wording, like others may argue, to cue the reader that you've moved on to this point of the essay. You're going to state the opposing viewpoint and then explain why others might argue that viewpoint. Finally, you're going to restate your position and explain why, despite the opposing viewpoint you just mentioned, your position is still superior.
Artistic expression begins within us.
Before we practice this argument essay, let's go over some course concepts we'll need to know in order to answer the prompt. This prompt says, an important feature of a democratic republic is that it represents the will of the people. Take a position on whether constitutional checks and balances or citizen participation in social movements is more effective in ensuring the people's will is represented. So to answer this prompt, we're first going to need to understand what checks and balances are. Checks and balances are a key principle of government. They were mentioned in Madison's Federalist I and was created as an additional safeguard for separation of powers. While separation of powers ensures that each branch of government has its own powers and responsibilities, checks and balances serves as an auxiliary precaution by giving each branch the power to oversee or check the other 2. For example, the president can check Congress by vetoing legislation. Congress can check the president by confirming or denying his appointments. And finally, the judiciary can declare acts of the president or laws passed by Congress unconstitutional with their power of judicial review. Next, we need to understand social movements. These are organized efforts by groups of people to change laws, policies, or practices. One of the most famous social movements in U.S. history was the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. But other groups, like women and members of the LGBTQ+ community, have also used social movements to effect change. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution lays out the structure of the legislative branch. It establishes the House and Senate. Article 1, Section 8 holds those delegated and enumerated powers of Congress. And Article 1, Section 9 outlines the denied powers of Congress. Federalist 10 is one of our Federalist essays written by James Madison. It addresses the concern of factions or groups of people united for a common interest. Madison suggests that factions cannot be eliminated, and to do so would mean eliminating liberty or giving every individual the same beliefs and passions. Instead, society must control the effects of factions. He believes that a large representative republic is the best way to combat factions because in a large diverse republic, there will be so many factions that it will prevent an all-powerful majority faction from forming. And finally, Letter from a Birmingham Jail was written by MLK while in prison in Birmingham after a peaceful protest. The letter was addressed to the white clergy of the city who were asking him to moderate his actions. He famously says that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and that people have a duty and a responsibility to disobey unjust laws. He also says that his movement could wait no longer. They had tried diplomacy and nothing had changed. Civil disobedience was their last resort, and he encouraged the white clergy to stand up for the movement and not be waffling like the rest of the white moderates. All right, let's practice this argument essay. Part A, respond to the prompt with a defensible claim or thesis that establishes a line of reasoning. As a reminder, we're being asked to take a position on whether constitutional checks and balances or citizen participation in social movements is more effective in ensuring the people's will is represented. Just as a clue, I'm going to be taking the position of citizen participation, but you're welcome to choose either option. Please pause the video now and craft your response. The student answered, citizen participation in social movements is more effective than checks and balances in ensuring the people's will is represented because if the people don't speak up through action, they will never be heard by their government. Let's see where the student earned the points. First, they clearly take a position. They state their claim that it is citizen participation, not checks and balances, that is better in ensuring the people's will is represented. And then with the because connection, they give their line of reasoning that if people don't speak up through action, they will never be heard by government. For part B, we're going to use our first piece of evidence that needs to come from a foundational document. As a reminder, only one piece of evidence needs to come from one of the prompt documents. I highly recommend you do it as your evidence 1 so you don't forget about it. You're welcome to choose any of these 3 documents, Article 1, Federalist 10, or Letter from a Birmingham Jail. I'm going to be choosing Federalist number 10, but again, you can choose any of the 3. Please pause the video now and craft your response. The student answered, the Federalist 10 claims the only way to ensure factions do not take over is to control them. This is said because factions can never be destroyed. If they were, democracy would fall as well. Factions are necessary in representing the will of the people. Let's see where the student earned the point. The student chose a foundational document, Federalist 10, from the prompt, and then accurately described it as it related to their thesis. All right, our second piece of evidence can come from any foundational document in the prompt, or it can be from a Supreme Court case or a knowledge of other course concepts. I'm going to be choosing a second prompt document, letter from a Birmingham jail, but again, you're welcome to choose Article 1, since we didn't use that as the first one, or you can choose another course concept or Supreme Court come to choose Article 1. I'm going to be choosing a second prompt document, letter from a Birmingham jail, but again, you're welcome to choose Article 1, since we didn't use that as the first one, or you can choose another course concept or Supreme Court case if you choose. Please pause the video now and craft your response.
Just as good as if it's falling over. They look better. But what? Keep your jackets on, right? Just lean on button, you know. Let the moose the left. Where's
The student said, letter from a Birmingham jail claims that no change will come from government unless people fight for it. Martin Luther King often led social movements to protect the unfair treatment of black citizens in America. The student is going to earn the point because they chose a second foundational document and a prompt document as their second piece of evidence, and they accurately described it as it relates to their thesis. All right, part C is our reasoning. We need to use reasoning to explain why the evidence we just described supports our claim or thesis, and in this case, supports our thesis that citizen participation is more effective in ensuring the people's will is represented. Please pause the video now and craft your response. The student answered, the only way to truly ensure your will is heard by the government is to force them to pay attention. After years of protesting, attention was called to King's issue by the government. So the key phrase in this student's response is the last sentence. The student earns a reasoning point for accurately explaining how citizen participation is more effective than checks and balances because it gains the attention of the government as an issue to be addressed. And finally, part D. Remember, we're not writing a conclusion. We're responding to an opposing or alternate perspective using refutation or rebuttal. So since our thesis statement was that citizen participation is more effective, we should be describing the opposing viewpoint that checks and balances is more effective. Please pause the video now and craft your response.
you kidding me, man? This bumper's gonna go on the wall of my garage, carnal. So the new little San Andreas is gonna say, this bumper was pulled off by the bus of Salinas. I mean, anything for Salinas.
What were you thinking of? Who's that laugh? Is that Selena? Listen, where are you? You didn't care about his bumper, huh?
Daddy was happy. You should have seen these two big, tough-looking troubles. Is that right, Joe? Yeah, man. They had tattoos and goatees there. Man, you want to hang his bumper in his garage. Hey, he was anything for Salina. Not Selena, but Salina with an S. Weird. And then he didn't let me pay for it. He was happy to have his bumper taken out by our bus. Or by Salinas.
The student answered, some may argue that checks and balances are needed to ensure that the federal government does not become too powerful and silence the people's will entirely. While this can be argued, even with a system of checks and balances, change rarely ever comes without people displaying their voices. So the student used some great transitional wording to cue the reader that they are beginning their part D, and they clearly identify the opposing viewpoint of checks and balances, and then they acknowledge the opposing argument, but they reiterate that change rarely ever comes without people displaying their voices, which is their ultimate thesis that citizen participation in social movements is more effective than checks and balances. If you need more argument essay practice, I encourage